And so they have to borrow capital from Christianity to get their worldview going, but they don't want the God that makes it all possible.
Right.
So they want the God, this is amazing, they want the God whose character they need.
Yeah.
But they don't want him.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna go first.
Yes.
I was gonna talk to you guys about a recent episode of Joe Rogan.
Okay.
With
another atheist that's probably fun to hang out with.
Someone, yeah, I mean, but so he had, I'm totally blanking on this guy's first name, but last name Trussell.
Trussell.
He's just like a comedian. He did some stuff with Funny or Die, Drunk History.
Okay.
Podcaster. For some reason in this episode, he's wearing like a ghillie suit.
What?
Like I was
because of the contact.
I was like listening to it and working, and I kind of see it out of the corner of my eye, and I thought he had these like very intense dreadlocks, and then I looked and I was like, no, that's not what that is. But anyway, so they just like right out of the gate in this episode, they're talking about like how wouldn't it be just great if people could have like a less literal reading of religious texts, and if we could just like take the awesome principles from religion, specifically Christianity. And I don't even have a joke. I just knew that I heard him say these words, and I knew that Jeff would want to talk about this.
Yeah.
He's in the middle, so he's going on this little like mini rant about how you know the Bible's just been like written down a bunch of times, and it can't, you know, just all very, very easy stuff. Like just on the nose, like we've answered that a million times over and over again. And he said to his guests, he said, you know that people are known liars. I mean, why do we have court? Because people lie. And I just thought, I thought he was going to really take a jab at like why we have court. And his answer was, oh, because people lie.
Yeah.
So humans created court and the law because people lie, and we were just trying to get down to the bottom of the things. So what do you have to say about that? What do you have to say about stripping just, you know, the Bible of just getting down to those basic principles of love and being a good person? And then what do you think about why we have court?
Yeah. Well, obviously, I'll do a burst here. So it's interesting is that you have atheists who want to borrow capital from Christianity in order to make their world work, because they're in the image of God, first and foremost, and they can't escape it. So they don't want God in their knowledge. They don't want to know him, but they certainly can't abandon the image of God that's in them. That's why atheists still go home and kiss their wives and love their children and pay their bills. And atheists get angry and call the cops when somebody steals their car stereo.
Take you to court.
Yeah, that's why atheists take people to court, and they demand we have court and justice, because they know that the world that they profess to believe in isn't the reality, and they couldn't live in it if it were.
Or I read some terrible thing going on in the world. Yes, those are tragedies going on in the world. My response is, nothing matters. It's all empty and meaningless. This is how the world is. Get used to it. Get on with it, girl.
That sounds like a very Zen Buddhist way of dealing.
I guess it is.
Meaning.
Well, it's a paradoxical way, though. Because
it is kind of paradoxical.
The first part of that is nihilistic, and the second part isn't. So how do you reconcile those two things? Why get on with it, girl?
It is a very positive way of living. To accept the meaningless and ultimate emptiness of everything, and accept that this creature here, this thing, this evolved creature just will get on with life.
But you're not accepting the meaninglessness of it, even by going through those actions that you described.
You don't think so?
Not
well,
at all,
how
because
can you say that?
Because you're acting as if those things are meaningful.
Yes, I am. I'm
right.
acting as though those things are
meaningful.
My way of putting it would be that those meanings are constructed by myself and others.
They're personal
and they're because the kind of creatures we are, because of the meme
But they're not constructed.
I'd like to hear
Hunger
Jordan's
isn't
response to
constructed. Neither is your desire to use the loo. None of that's constructed.
No. And that's exactly what I do.
What I said at the beginning is that the atheist types act out a religious structure and criticize it.
No, there's no religious structure. We come to this big question now.
And so they have to borrow capital from Christianity to get their worldview going, but they don't want the God that makes it all possible.
Right.
So they want the God, this is amazing, they want the God whose character they need.
Yeah.
but they don't want him.
Right. They want the attributes of God.
Right. They want the attributes of God
Got the book.
in the ways that will bless and affect them positively. But they don't want the attributes of God that infringe upon their delights,
right,
and all the rest. But it's interesting because, first of all the when someone brings up an argument like, well, the Bible's been translated and retranslated, and mistranslated, and that's where I immediately go, as much respect and love and patience as I can muster up. I go, you clearly have not spent 20 minutes.
Right.
In this conversation, because if you had, you would never dare put on public record that argument,
right?
Because it is too easy to take down, and so it just shows you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
When someone says, oh, "I don't," the Bible's put together at Nicaea. Who's going to believe that? I just want to. It's like like, do you know what the Council of Nicaea was about, and and why would you think that? But what's interesting is when someone talks about what I love about Christianity is I don't love all the Old Testament law stuff, God gave Moses commandments about justice and courts and everything else, all this crazy law. But what I love about Christianity is that principle from that guy who was love embodied, and he said love your neighbor as you love yourself. But I don't want all the rest of the laws. It's well, he also said that all of the law and the prophets are built upon love for God and love for neighbor.
Yeah.
So if you want the principle that everyone wants as image bearers of God, that you should love your neighbor as you love yourself, well then guess what? You also want every other principle that led to,
right,
in terms of don't lie to your neighbor, don't murder your neighbor, don't covet your neighbor's stuff, don't steal from your neighbor, and all the rest. And so the whole, even the idea of when an atheist decries lying, you just want to stop and go for a second, wait, stop and think about what you're saying. You just said you don't want that God.
Yeah.
The God who cannot lie.
Right.
The guy who tells us that lying is a sin, and it's an abominable thing to do to another human being. Don't lie, because God would never lie. He's not like that. He made you to not be like that. And when an atheist says, no, there is no God, there is no meaning, there's no purpose, all of us are just cosmic bags of broccoli bobbing along the cosmos and everything else. But we get really, we need courts because people lie. As if it was a problem, right? It's like there's an elephant in the room, and I smell something, right? We all smell it, and we all see it. But when the atheist says, we shouldn't lie, and people lie, and that's a bad thing, it's you realize, of course, that we all see that you have now left your platform, and you're standing on mine. See,
I do believe that the biblical texts are foundational. I believe it in the Nietzschean sense. And, Nietzsche, of course, announced famously in the late 1800s that God was dead. And the typical rationalist atheist regards that as a triumphalist proclamation. But that wasn't that for Nietzsche. And Nietzsche knew perfectly well and said immediately afterward that the consequences of that was going to be bloody catastrophe because everything was going to fall. And he predicted the rise of communism, for example, and the deaths of tens of millions of people in the aftermath of the death of God. Because Nietzsche knew perfectly well that when you pull the cornerstone out from underneath a building, that even though it may stay aloft in midair like a cartoon character that's wandered off a cliff for some period of time, that it will inevitably crumble.
Now, Nietzsche's ideas are very profound and interesting, but I just want to stop you from saying that he was absolutely right about somehow if we get rid of God, we're going to be worse, because we have very well-functioning societies in Scandinavia,
we were
for
pretty
example.
bad in the 20th century.
Oh, we were, yes. People were.
And we could easily drift that way again.
Obviously, from her perspective, Sue feels like actually we've got pretty stable societies that are increasingly secular these days. So perhaps Nietzsche was wrong, and in fact, we're not going to see this moral
Well, I would say
decay.
they're stable to the degree that they're actually not secular. And this is also a Nietzschean observation, and a Dostoevskian observation for that matter, is that we're living on the corpse of our ancestors, like we always have. That's a very old idea. But that stops being nourishing and starts to become rotten unless you replenish it. And I don't think we are replenishing it. We're in danger of we're living on borrowed time and in danger of running out of it. I think that the reason that the Western societies essentially work quite well is because they act out a Judeo-Christian ethic.
Like, this isn't your thing.
Right.
Like, it's me that's supposed to come with the puritanical, like, indignation, like, thou shalt not lie. That's mine. It's not yours. Like, what are you complaining about? Like, lying, what is lying? It's noises coming out of the hole in this bag's,
your
body.
backbone.
Like, it's noises, right? And it's all noises coming from chemical reactions happening in this 3-pound, fizz machine. Like, it's just, it's air and
Well, and
sound.
we just evolved our way into
Right.
being truth tellers.
Right.
We just evolved our way into a court.
Yeah.
We were like, bad things are happening and people are lying about how it happened, so we should establish a higher order for who decides what is evidence and what
Right.
is true. And it's
Right.
historically, that doesn't even make any sense. Like, that's not the history of courts.
Yeah, and they'll say things like, if we just permitted lying all the time, things would go really bad. It's like, yeah, because it's God's world, you
Right.
dingleberry. Like,
Yes.
it's like, it's because that's how it works here in this
Right.
world. And when people say, like, it would get really bad if if you get really bad if everyone's lying all the time, it's like you go, well, of course, but you're acting like bad is bad.
Yeah.
like it's like
Yeah,
like it matters.
Addressing atheists, you say you're simply not an atheist in your actions, and it is your actions.
Or
that
if you
most
are, look out.
Are you saying that no one is really an atheist deep down?
I didn't say no one was.
Okay.
I said that most of the people who claim to be atheists aren't. So this is why I like Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. Because Raskolnikov tried to act like an atheist, right? He took the ideas that were floating around, Dostoevsky took the ideas that were floating around in the late 1800s, which are still the ideas that we're discussing today. One most fundamental idea, I suppose, being after Nietzsche's announcement of the death of God, that if there is no God, then anything is permitted.
It's like you've picked an arbitrary thing because, there's little huddles and communities of people that like to do really bad things. Like, how about pirates? Like, those are communities and tribes, collections of atoms that have evolved over time, right, in a purposeless universe. And they've determined, well, I know that's your stuff, but it's not your stuff.
Right.
It's my stuff. Like, there are people, collections of people that have determined for themselves, we think it's okay to oppress. We think it's a virtue to kill Jews. I think it's virtuous to enslave black people might say. I think it's virtuous to steal people's stuff. Now, you're saying with your tribe, Mr. Atheist, you're saying with your tribe, I don't think it's virtuous to steal, to kill, to lie, to destroy. I go, well, pick a number, friend, because there's a whole bunch of other tribes over here that really like to eat other people.
Right.
Like, what's your argument with them? You can't just say, well, I don't really like that. Because if there's enough of them that overwhelms your tribe, guess what? What you like is irrelevant. Because what they like wins because there's more of them, maybe? So the point is like, who's to say that it's not in this cosmic accident universe where it's just a bunch of atoms banging around? Who's to say that what's virtuous isn't a society that just lies to each other?
Well, I think most people in our society determine on a nearly daily basis that it's more helpful
To lie.
to lie to somebody.
Yeah.
Why?
that's
Because
true.
it benefits me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or it benefits somebody I love?
Yeah.
Or it benefits my future? Or something? Like, isn't it virtuous to have good things happen? Well, maybe it would be virtuous to have something good happen to me because I lie through my teeth to you, and it helps. What if I think a little white lie to serve my family and my tribe actually helps, like, the longevity of my tribe through this white lie? And I recognize that it's going to hurt you probably significantly or maybe even a little bit, but I recognize that it helps my tribe more. And there's more people that are going to be blessed because of my white lie.
Right.
Right? And so that's virtuous, right? Isn't it virtuous? Like, to injure you for the benefit of more people? And so people think like that. So the question is, for the atheist, like, do you have an objective standard outside of yourself to stand on to say, because of this is an absolute? And it exists outside of my taste. It exists outside of my feelings, my emotions, my likes, and those sorts of things. It's true whether or not I like it. So, for example, I say that in kidnapping and enslaving black people deserves the death penalty and is absolutely immoral.
Mm-hmm.
And I can say that because God has spoken in Revelation about his own character and us, and he's given us revelation about what's actually true about that. So I have a basis to actually decry slavery. I have a basis to decry kidnapping. I have a basis to decry rape and those sorts of things. And it's not something that's just a personal preference. It's an objective revelation, a standard outside of myself. I have that to stand on. The atheist has nothing.
Right.
And there's no complaint, no moral complaint.
I would have liked to have asked them, and it kind of ties us into what you're saying. If they want to take the basic principles of religious texts, what about the Quran? And I'm willing to bet they would say, I don't like those religious principles in that one.
Yeah.
And again, that brings back to, well, why?
Yeah. Well, for
Who's to
whatever
determine
reason,
which is okay.
for whatever reason, their
Yeah.
conversation primarily hinged on
Maybe it's
Christianity.
because they're created in God's image.
Yeah, Mormonism was thrown in there a few times, but I think that's typically because, well, they made the statement that, like, the Mormons they know are very nice, good people, and so they were the whole foundation of their conversation was just like, religion is a good thing that helps people be good. And also they tried to make a point about how, like, we need, like, humans need something, like, larger than themselves and, like, sort of mythical to create standards of morality. The ghillie suit guy was talking about how people go on ayahuasca trips and, like, a dragon tells them to, like, love yourself. But if your Uber driver tells you to love yourself, then you're not as likely to listen to him because he's your Uber driver.
What if he's a dragon, though?
I know. What if that's Uber's newest thing?
Yeah.
It's dragon drivers.
Yeah, dragon.
Dragon
Self-driving cars and
dragon driving cars.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
You, like, open it up and you get to pick.
Yeah.
Self-drive? No, I want the dragon driver
I want the
today.
unicorn.
Yeah. No, that would be genius.
Anyway, it was just another example of Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
I really just wish he would talk to you.
You divide up this book into, 4 parts. And I thought it was very well outlined. And so I'd like to walk through these various sections: origins, dogmas, indoctrination, and restoration. I must admit that the 4th and final section was the only very hope-filled section, and it came in the nick of time. Because I think what this book does is it sobers you. It makes you aware of deeply rooted ideologies that are traceable back to the Frankfurt School, as you do, but also to Marx, to Hegel, to 19th century people who are long dead, and yet they rule the world from the grave, you might say. And that would include, I suppose, Nietzsche, as well as Darwin and especially Freud. So, origins, part 1, where you actually start to dig up the roots. What's going on there?
Yeah. So I start, I think, saying that the most obvious place to pinpoint it is with a snake in the garden cajoling the first woman that you shall be as gods. And I do think that is, imbued in throughout the movement of self-deification. But really in modern times, you place it with Marx, and particularly with Hegel, Marx was so influenced by. And I think you're absolutely right that, these people, their thoughts really are ruling the world, but most people haven't read them. That's what's so interesting, is that it's just the water in which we swim, but we don't understand how much of these presuppositions we've adopted. Particularly, I think the engine of the dialectic, that Hegelian engine of dialectic, that I think informs even a seemingly innocuous modern popular phrase like, do you want to be on the right side of history? You can interpret that in a way that seems right and good. But that really is a very Hegelian concept, this idea that there's this future kind of utopian, perfectly progressive state. And it is by that future state by which we will be judged now. Not by our ancestors who preceded us, but rather by, the perfection, this, idealized perfect man in the future. And that really creates a situation where you have no limiting principle on progressive revolution. That you want to hasten the progress, right? Because you don't want to be the last person to get on the right side of history, and so it gives us incentive to push the envelope more and more, keep going, keep pushing, in ways that ultimately become violent. I think.
Okay, stop
and
there.
forceful.
Go back to Hegel. George Hegel dies around 1831. German philosopher, an idealist who believes in absolute spirit, but is best known for introducing a way of thinking, and that is the dialectic. And you explain it so clearly. I'm not sure I've ever seen it explained any better, where the thesis generates the antithesis that resolves in a synthesis. But generally, the thesis is the status quo, the way things are, which invariably proves to be the wrong side of history. Well, I mean, nobody is ever satisfied or content with the status quo. And so you already have a sort of bias built into the formulation here. But what happens next when this ideology of the dialectic unfolds through time?
Right. So so the ideas interact with nature, or the state in particular, and there's always going to be contradictions that arise from that interaction of synthesis and antithesis. And through the working out of those contradictions or conflicts, then you arrive at the new synthesis. And interestingly, Hegel analogizes it to the Trinity, that he says, the idea is sort of like God the Father interacting with the state of nature, or the state of society, which is God the Son. So you already see the state becoming our savior, and then emanating from that interaction comes the Holy Spirit, or the new synthesis, and then that becomes the new thesis, and then there's a new antithesis. So you see, it creates this revolving revolution that keeps pushing and changing and progressing, eventually, theoretically, to that point where all of the contradictions are resolved, and there's no more contradictions. We have men living in perfect harmony with one another, and that's laid the groundwork for that utopian state, or that, as I think Eric Voegelin calls it, the immanentization of the eschaton. It's bringing heaven onto earth.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I hate this argument. In fact, I loathe taking part in it almost more than any other argument I ever take part in. For why? Because I have to come up here and defend the religion of love, brotherhood, peace, justice, and turning the other cheek rather than kicking the other guy in the crotch. And I have to listen while I'm doing it to these gentlemen who remind me constantly of the most irritating, infuriating, revolting person I ever knew, namely my adolescent self. Honestly. I mean, haven't we all heard it all before? Horus, Mithras, they're all the same. No, they're not all the same. They all disagree with each other. They must be wrong. They can't all be right. This is the stuff of sixth form debate. There has been nothing serious said against the concept of God by the opposition this evening at all. I am expecting something serious to come from the third speaker, but there hasn't been anything so far. I'm really hoping, because it would be nice. Because this is not fundamentally a serious discussion as it has been held so far from the other side. And it's not serious for a very simple reason. It's not arguing about what we ought to be arguing about. I'm going to have a little bit of poetry here for those of you who appreciate that sort of thing. It's from the 38th chapter of the book of Job. God speaks from the whirlwind, and he asks, "Who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened? Or who laid the cornerstone thereof?" The answer, ladies and gentlemen, from the opposition is they haven't a clue. Nor have I. Nor has anybody in this room. We haven't the faintest idea. Nothing that any of us could say here tonight could convince anybody that they knew that God existed. What we are discussing here is a matter of opinion. And a matter of opinion, Mr. President, is a matter of choice. And the real question before us is why we choose what we choose. And this is the most fascinating part of the argument, addressed by the most intelligent and interesting atheist, I think, now living, Thomas Nagel, who asks repeatedly, why is it that I and my fellow atheists so much want there not to be a God? Why is it, ladies and gentlemen, they so much want there not to be a God? Why would you want there not to be a God? Why would you want to live in a purposeless chaos in which none of your actions had any significance, in which there was no hope of justice, in which the lives of all those whom you loved ended abruptly at death and had no further significance? Why would you want, desire, actively wish to live in a universe as disgusting as that? You'd have to have a very good reason. And I think these gentlemen do have a very good reason, and it's what they never ever wish to discuss. They don't want justice. They do want the dead to be dead. They do want the universe to be purposeless. They do not want their own individual actions to have any other significance than their immediate effect. You will have to discuss with them why they should be so keen on that proposition. But from our side of the argument, what we say is that if we desire justice for ourselves, we also desire it for other people. And likewise, if we desire it for other people, we require it for ourselves and we bring it upon ourselves. And on the basis of that, we construct, with some difficulty, with a certain amount of historical knowledge, in the case of some of us with an enormous amount of scientific knowledge of the universe, we construct a belief which helps us to discover, insofar as it is possible, what it is we ought to do and how it is we ought to live, in the belief that there is justice, that there is hope, that death is not the end, that our actions have a significance beyond what we immediately do. That really is what we are discussing. Do you want it or do you not want it? If you don't want it, then you can simply turn with raillery and badinage and mock the beliefs of others. I don't care to do that. I think atheists have a serious point of view. I understand why they seem so anxious to press it upon you, and I know, thanks to the general destruction and retreat of institutional Christianity in our society, that many, many people growing up feel under a great deal of conformist pressure because it is very fashionable to follow atheism at the moment. And I also know that a number of people who are, in the end, servants of power are quite anxious to dispel from our society the enormous force of restraint upon power which Christian belief provides. It's interesting that we had, he wasn't properly named, but Laplace quoted earlier on this evening as mocking the idea that he needed any such concept as God because he understood the universe perfectly without it. Quite why it stays up, I don't know, but he thought that he didn't need that explanation. Look up Laplace, some of you, and find out what an extremely nasty piece of work he was. I've no wonder he had no need for the concept of God. People like that don't, because God in our society stands very much against. And this is why I, after many, many years of not believing in God, came round to the view that I would choose to do so and act as if there is a God. God is the principal opposition in our society to lawless, ruthless power, to the bully, to the autocrat, to the despot, to the criminal, to the person who treats his neighbors like dirt. Fundamentally, once we have dispensed with that concept in our society, we are left with nothing. Now, the atheists don't wish to discuss this because they know exactly what I'm saying. They're very well aware of the implications of what I'm saying for society in general. They know perfectly well that if everybody didn't believe in God, the comfortable lives they live in extremely agreeable suburbs, where they can trust people not to cheat them and rob them and mug them and rape them, would come to an end. They want to keep the secret to themselves. They want to have all the joys, not just now, all the joys and all the advantages provided by Christianity, but not pay the dues. No, not just now, because I'm just finishing. I normally do, but this evening I've decided not to. I've decided just to give them a Christian kicking. And that is why, when you challenge the atheist side on this very point, they run from it refusing to discuss it. That is why nobody ever answers Thomas Nagel's question. Why is it that they so much want there not to be a God? Well, I'll tell you exactly why. It's for precisely the same reasons as I very much want there to be one. Vote for the motion, please.
The clip that we're about to watch features a conversation between David Berlinski, Stephen Meyer, and David Galertner, who is a professor of computer science at Yale University. They're discussing Darwin's theory of evolution, and I know this is like a sacred cow that you're not supposed to mess with. I'll be real with you guys, this is my first time watching through this video. I just watched it, and I was really surprised by a lot of the new mathematical realities that are kind of contending against Darwin's theory. So I'm gonna stop talking now, play the clip out, play the conversation out. I'll give you guys some of my thoughts on the back end and some of the cognitive dissonance that even I was experiencing while I was watching this. So let's dive in, and then I'll give you guys my thoughts on the back end.
So the ratio of functional to non-functional is 1 over 10 to the 77th power.
Okay, so functioning proteins are extremely rare. It's very hard to imagine random mutations leading to functional proteins, except that, and here I quote Dr. Galertner again, but the theory understands that mutations are rare, and successful ones even scarcer. Darwinism knows this. To balance that out, there are many organisms and a staggering immensity of time. Your chances of winning might be infinitesimal, but if you play the game often enough, you win in the end. Correct?
That's the
And
theory.
that's the question. Do you play it often enough? There's always an often enough, and the question is, does the history of life with which Darwin was concerned allow you enough chances to make it at all probable, let's say, or even possible that you'll hit on one, statistically, that you'll hit on one of those amazingly rare necklaces that folds up into a protein that can be stuck in a cell and actually doing anything. I'm not a biologist, and so I look at this and say, yeah, sure, there's enough time. You know, there's been a lot of creatures on Earth, and life has gone on for a long time, but when biologists look at this and try and nail it down and figure it out, try and make a guess, try and use heuristics to make a guess, like using the number of total bacterial lifetime as a measure of the number of total mutations we're playing with. The point is, from whatever angle you come at it, the answer is no, there has not been enough time. The number of throws we've had is too puny even to talk about. It doesn't even approach puniness, and certainly is nowhere near reasonable. So we would get that if we had a reasonable time, but we don't. We didn't. We haven't.
So let me just be very explicit from my little Winnie the Pooh bear-sized mind. You are saying that Darwin is unlikely to be able. It's unlikely that species arose the way Darwin said, or you are saying it is impossible. Darwin was just mystic, lovely man, beautiful idea.
There's hardly a difference. There's hardly a difference. Unlikely, impossible. We're talking about odds that are so prohibitive. If you wish to say it's impossible, fine. I'll defend you saying it's impossible. If you wish to say it's highly unlikely, I'll be in your corner as defense attorney as well. But there's no practical difference. We've known about these things for hundreds of years. Right? You get 1 million monkeys at 1 million typewriters, all of them typing at random. We know they're not going to produce the collected works of Shakespeare in anything like a reasonable amount of time. It's like that wonderful episode of The Simpsons. Do you remember it? Mr. Burns has 1 million monkeys typing at 1 million typewriters. They're going to produce the greatest novel ever written. He pulls out one sheet of paper and says, it was the best of times, it was the blurst of times.
It was the best of times, it was the blurst of times, you stupid monkey.
Stupid monkey.
Or to put the discussion down even lower, the Jim Carrey film, where he's trying to get a date with a young lady he fancies, and she tells him to go away. He says, well, what are the odds a girl like me and a guy like you could get together? You know, not good. And he says, what do you mean, not good? Well, like 1 in 100? And she says, like 1 in 1 million. And then he says, but if there's a chance.
So you're telling me there's a chance? Yeah! I read you.
Here's a precise way of cashing out this probabilistic argument. If you have 1 over 10 to the 77th power as your ratio, but then you have if every organism in the history of the planet, and we can estimate that, about 10 to the 40th organisms. So you divide
bacteria, little tiny things, everything, every
time
mosquito,
one of those-
every bacterium.
Yeah, every time one of those replicates, there's a possibility for a mutation that could search the space of possibilities. So you got 10 to the 40th possible mutations against a search space 10 to the 77th strong.
Right.
So if you do your exponential math, you end up with, what it means is you can search 1/10 trillion trillionth of the possible combinations. So in that case, are you more likely to succeed or fail? You're overwhelmingly more likely to fail to find one of the functional combinations, even taking into account every organism that's lived on Earth. And that means that the Darwinian hypothesis is overwhelmingly more likely to be false than true.
It just didn't happen. Okay, one last piece of the argument here that you mentioned. There are other pieces in this book, of course, and in David's book. But here's one last that you mentioned in your essay is compelling to you, David Gelernter. To help create a brand new, and this is the question of mutations proving harmful at least as often as useful, if I have it right. To help create a brand new form of organism, a mutation must affect a gene that does its job early and in the development of the life form and controls the expression of other genes that come into play as the organism grows. Evidently, there are a total of no examples in the literature of mutations that affect early development and the body plan as a whole and are not fatal. Somebody explain that one to me briefly. Who wants to?
David can give you
A good argumentative disjunction. If you talk about major changes, if they come late in development, they're not going to make a difference. The organism is already constructed. May have
Maybe
more
the color
lavish
of the fur,
eyebrows.
right, okay.
If they come early, they can't make a difference because inevitably they destroy the organism.
Too many things downstream depend on those early cell
Exactly.
divisions.
So we're faced with a real destructive dilemma. Late, no good. Early, no good. Well, when? We've sort of exhausted the possibilities.
And I'm sure that David Gelernter wants to stick up for Darwin one more time and say he couldn't have known this.
This is not an attack on Darwin as a man or a thinker or a scientist, but it's the job of science to figure out what guesses are right and what are wrong. Scientists are paid for making guesses, not for making right guesses, but for making interesting, plausible ones. And if scientists, after the guess has been made, don't do their job, don't investigate the guess, don't do their best to figure out is it true or false, then we are false to science and we're betraying science.
Intelligent design, from David Gelernter's essay. The evidence suggests to Meyer, who's seated with us today, that an intelligent designer must have been responsible. I can't accept intelligent design as Meyer presents it. Close quote. You also have seated next to you David Berlinski, this is David, who has said that his attitude toward intelligent design, and I'm quoting him, is warm but distant. It's the same attitude that I display toward my ex-wives. So you have one man who can't accept it, another man who definitely wants to keep his distance.
That leaves Meyer out.
So well, I don't know, you want to start the easier case? Try to convince David? Tell us what intelligent design is that distinguishes it from some kind of effort to sneak God in by some back door.
Sure. The intelligent design...
But parenthetically, just one word.
Yeah.
That's definitely not Steve's intention. In this book, in Intelligent Design, it's not a way to bring in a theological argument. It is a scientific approach, purely and absolutely valid scientifically. One can agree with it or disagree with it, but one doesn't have to reject it insofar as theology making an illegal move, because that's not what he's doing.
That's not what you... Good.
Let me just sketch the argument
Sure.
briefly, and then we can just discuss it. The big discovery of the 1950s and 60s was that the DNA molecule encodes information in a roughly digital or alphabetic or typographic form.
Why do you use the term digital?
Well, because in computer science we have characters, zeros and ones.
I see.
This is Crick, 1957, is the sequence hypothesis. He realized that the information in DNA, or the chemical subunits of DNA called nucleotide bases, were functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like the zeros and ones in a section of computer code. That is to say, it wasn't their chemical properties that gave them their function, but rather their specific arrangement in accord with an independent symbol convention, which was later explicated in the form of what we call the genetic code. So we had genetic text functioning according to a code.
So it really was it was pure information.
This is a genuine information storage system. Crick, by the way, was a code breaker in World War II. So this is fascinating, is an application of the information sciences to molecular biology. Now, this is the argument that I make, is that what we know from experience is that information, whether we find it in a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal or in a section of computer code, whenever we find information and we trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. And what I do in the book, in Darwin's Doubt, and in my prior book, Signature in the Cell, is show that these undirected evolutionary mechanisms that have been proposed as an explanation for the origin of information fail for various reasons. We've talked about the reason the Darwinian mechanism fails, because it can't search the space when it's so vast. The odds are overwhelmingly against it. So if we, from a materialistic evolutionary standpoint, don't have any explanation for the origin of the information that's necessary to build new biological form. And yet we do know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, of a source of information, of a cause of the origin of information. That cause is intelligence or mind. And so what I've argued in both Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell is that what we're seeing in life is evidence of the activity of a directing mind in the history of life.
The only thing that we know of that creates information is mind, is intelligence. I find it to be extremely exposing of the bias against God when people will simply not look to mind as the cause for that effect of information, but rather have to try to come up with some type of a materialistic, naturalistic explanation for this amazing amount of complex information that exists even within the most basic cell. So I think that, again, when it comes to a conversation like this, we all sort of have our sacred cow. We all sort of have our own preferences and biases. I'll admit that mine is against evolution because of how evolution has kind of been used to try to discredit God within a historical context, even though that's been stretched intellectually beyond what it can actually support. But again, I'll admit that if the theory of evolution actually was proved to be true, if it was true, I would believe it. I want to believe what is true, and I hope you do as well. So no matter what side of this conversation that you're on, whether you're a Christian or whether you're an atheist, I think it's valuable to look at this, theory from the 1800s and assess, is it holding up against time? And if it isn't, then we should reject it, no matter if we're atheist or Christian. And if it is true, if it does become more and more supported over time, then we should embrace it, regardless of where we stand. So I just think it's interesting because for whatever reason, evolution feels like one of these sacred cows that you can't question or touch or mess with. And I don't know, I find this conversation to be extremely interesting. I think the part about information inside of cells pointing toward mind being the only thing that we know of that causes that level of coding and detailed information, I think that's also a clue. I think that's pointing toward an intelligent mind. And I think that, again, intellectual integrity would cause us all, regardless of what our preferences or biases are, to consider these things, to actually be open-minded enough to be willing to follow the evidence wherever it may lead.
I would just add to that on a more personal level. I think a lot of times it's just people are looking for interesting theories that kind of take you off on rabbit trails of philosophical speculation rather than letting the truth get to them. Romans 1 says, even though they know what is true, they suppress the truth and they look for other beliefs and other theories. And I know as I share my faith with people, often they will raise, what seems like a good objection, and I give what I think seems like a good answer. And rather than going, oh, okay, that's really helpful, they realize, okay, that's not working, so they throw out something else, and I give what I think is a good answer to that, and they go to the next thing. And about 4 or 5 levels into this, I sometimes just go, time out. Can I just be really honest with you? And they go, sure. I say, I feel like you're working harder at finding excuses not to consider what I'm talking about than you are at finding the truth. And the Bible says we should be lovers of truth. I think that's a good philosophy for anyone, whether they believe the Bible or not. Let's love what's real. Let's pursue what's right and what's true. And I think I'm giving you a lot of truth, and it seems to me like you're trying to dodge it. And I've actually asked people, I go, can I just ask you honestly, is there some reason you don't want this to be true? Or is there something in your life you're afraid you'd have to give up or change if it is true? And I've had people admit to me, that, well, I know that if I admit God's real or that the Bible's true, that God's going to want to change my sex life, or he's going to want to change this or that. I'm going, you're probably right. And I'm pretty sure this is the real issue now, not whether we're some projected experiment from some mind somewhere, or whatever their theory was. So I think sometimes it's just a dodge, and I think sometimes we just have to kind of pull it back and get honest, get real with people. And some of them will go with us on that. And again, I think that's helping to remove barriers and get back to the real mission, which is to present Christ and the gospel to them.